Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. It's very great to be hosting you today. My name is Omar Dahi. I'm the director of the Security in Context Research Network. We are hosting a discussion today on the evolving geopolitics of the Middle East in light of several major developments in the past few years that we thought would be worth pausing and reflecting on in terms of their implications for the states and societies of the region. These include developments, of course, at the global level, most prominently the Russian war in Ukraine, but also before that, the US withdrawal from Afghanistan and other, of course, developments. Regionally, we have several things taking place as well. The increasing ties between Arab League governments and Syria, including readmitting Syria into the Arab League, the re-election of President Erdogan in Turkey, and of course, the surprise event of the past few years, which is the peace deal, or I guess I should say the reestablishment of diplomatic ties, peace deal in quotes, the establishment of diplomatic ties between Saudi Arabia and Iran that was announced earlier this year in March, I believe, that was sponsored by China. Of course, all of these are taking place in light of ongoing conflicts that are unresolved in various ways, that are also accompanied by major humanitarian disasters, including Syria, Yemen, Libya, and perhaps what we could say is authoritarian retrenchment is perhaps not a sufficient term, but perhaps one way to describe the increasing crackdown of dissent and polarization taking place in the region. So to help us make sense of all of this, we have a great panel that's going to be discussing these developments with us and really trying to help us kind of understand the biggest structural changes, what's at stake, how can we make sense of all of this, what are the interests and the roles of the major actors, and how do we think about the implications of these shifts really moving forward. And with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. I'll introduce the speakers as we go along. And we're really planning to have this panel be 1 hour. So if you think of a question, if you're attending and really want to get your question in, please put it in the chat function. I'll be asking each of our speakers to give an opening round of about 5 to 7 minutes so that we can have as much as possible an ongoing discussion. And then we'll kind of do a second round and start incorporating any questions that the audience might have. We'll also be posting the full bios of our distinguished speakers in the chat function. You can read them there. So I'll just very briefly introduce their title, and I'd like to invite our first speaker, Mouin Rabbani, who is co-editor of the Jadaliya e-zine and the host of the show Connections, the online show Connections on current events and policy. Mouin, if you could please set the stage for us at the regional level in terms of how can we understand the main shifts that have taken place. Obviously, there's a lot to get into, and we might not touch on all the details, but if you could kind of give us a sense of an overview of these shifts and the main actors involved.
Thank you very much, Omar and Maria, and my thanks to Security in Context and the University of Notre Dame for the invitation to participate in this webinar. Just to continue, Omar, from your introductory comments, we are witnessing important developments in the geopolitical disposition of MENA states, Middle East and North African states, even if the magnitude of these changes is often overstated. The aftermath of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan and the war in Ukraine can help us understand and help illustrate these changes. But having said that, they do not represent inflection points, but rather elements of a longer and larger process. The MENA region today is experiencing the convergence of several distinct yet related dynamics. These include a diversification of strategic relationships, the reduction of regional polarization, and I emphasize reduction rather than elimination, and efforts to restore the Arab regional order after more than a decade of upheaval, as you indicated, Omar, to try to put an end to this upheaval and challenges to existing governments and regimes. Interestingly, Saudi Arabia has emerged as a key driver of these developments. While this may seem surprising and even counterintuitive, these changes did not materialize overnight and reflect a series of broader local, regional, and global transformations. Recent decades have seen substantial developments in the region's relationships with global powers, the United States, Russia, and China. For example, the People's Republic of China is today MENA's main trading partner, and for most energy producers, their main export market as well. Moscow is today Riyadh's main partner in setting oil policy through the OPEC Plus framework. Unlike Washington, Russia and China today maintain bilateral relations with all MENA states, and Russia in particular has additionally forged ties with many other significant regional players and is also becoming, and to a lesser extent China, an increasingly important source of weapons deliveries to the region. Yet the most interesting changes, in my view, have been in relations between MENA governments and the United States. Washington may be pivoting to Asia, but remains very present in MENA, and its client states possess neither the intention nor capacity to sever their strategic relations with Washington. Doubts about US power began to emerge after the 2003 occupation of Iraq. The most powerful military in human history proved incapable of stabilizing a country thoroughly enfeebled by a decade of comprehensive sanctions, or of preventing its transformation into an Iranian zone of influence. The more recent and utterly chaotic US withdrawal from Afghanistan increased concerns about the US commitment to sustaining its regional allies and clients. Of even greater concern to Washington's MENA allies was a 2015 Iran nuclear agreement. It was, from their perspective, concluded without consideration of their interests, and they felt betrayed at what they perceived to be the US riding roughshod over their national security concerns in order to satisfy its own. Against this background, the arrival of Donald Trump in the White House and his unilateral renunciation of the Iran agreement was celebrated as a moment of salvation, but the celebration was short-lived when things did not proceed according to plan in the form of escalating Yemeni Houthi missile attacks on Saudi and later Emirati territory. The orange knight in shining armor failed to mount his steed. The Carter Doctrine appeared consigned to the dustbin of history. Regional rulers came to the painful realization that they would serve as undefended cannon fodder in any US confrontation with Iran. Matters have, to put it mildly, hardly improved since Joe Biden entered the White House and left Afghanistan pursuant to a deal concluded by Trump in scenes reminiscent of the final throes of the US defeat in Vietnam. What was previously assumed in concerned regional capitals to be a product of George W. Bush's idiocy and Obama's perfidy, in other words, was revealed to be a more fundamental problem: the reliability and dependability of the United States in the 21st century, and the wisdom of placing the entire carton of MENA eggs in the American basket. The response to the above developments has been diversification. Washington is still looked upon as the ultimate guarantor of regime security in times of existential crisis, but this has not precluded a strengthening of relations based on mutual interests with Russia and China. Thus, Riyadh has set oil policy in close coordination with Russia in willful disregard of the US and European energy agenda arising from the war in Ukraine. Similarly, Dubai has positioned itself as the main trading base for Russian oil after Geneva fell victim to Switzerland's adoption of EU sanctions. Indeed, MENA responses to the war in Ukraine provide an excellent illustration of strategic diversification. And with an eye on the clock, I suggest that we can get into this in more detail in the discussion period. The March 2023 agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran to resume diplomatic relations, and brokered by China, is the best illustration of regional attempts to reduce polarization. The same can be said for the normalization of relations with Damascus and developments in Yemen. While not a pioneer, Saudi Arabia has emerged as a key driver of these developments. Effectively, regional governments are putting their own interests first, ahead of those of their strategic patrons. This is, in my view, a very welcome development, and also, of course, is in sharp contrast to what we saw during the Cold War during the previous century. And there are, of course, other examples of reducing regional polarization, the resolution of the GCC crisis, reconciliation between Saudi Arabia and the Emirates on the one hand and Turkey on the other, bolstered now by very large investments. Of course, Syria's readmission to the Arab League, ongoing normalization efforts between Egypt on the one hand and Iran and Turkey on the other, and others. As these various initiatives have been unfolding, Western media speculation has tended to focus instead on the prospects of normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel. On the one hand, and as demonstrated previously by the United Arab Emirates, relations with Iran and with Israel are not mutually exclusive. At the same time, Riyadh at present has no interest to conclude an agreement similar to that consummated by Abu Dhabi. Saudi Arabia already maintains extensive relations with Israel, and aside from an outpouring of US goodwill, would derive no additional benefit from formal normalization. Finally, the states in the region, again led by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, despite their growing differences, appear to have devoted their energies to the reconstruction of what is known as the formal Arab order or Arab state system. Its revival, for all its many faults and limitations, is viewed by them as a better insurance policy against the upheaval of the past decade and for confronting new threats and challenges that may arise in a similar vein. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Main. Great summary of these changes and how the main actors in the region are thinking of them. And it's interesting you talk about how some of those efforts are really to reduce polarization within the region from actors that we previously thought of as kind of inflaming regional tensions. So we can come back to that. I'd like to next turn to Michael Clare, who is the Senior Fellow at the Arms Control Association, Defense Correspondent at The Nation magazine, and Emeritus Professor at Hampshire College. Michael, you and I spoke right after the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, and I asked you at the time if you think that symbolized the retrenchment of US foreign policy. And at the time you thought it was a big mistake to think of it that way. In fact, the US government and military are repositioning themselves to be even more aggressive internationally. So I still think of those words in the aftermath of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But can you tell us, as someone who's looked at US foreign policy around the world, and in particular the Middle East, how you see the US role right now and how is it evolving in light of its policies?
I'll do my best, Omar. It's a pleasure to join you and the panelists in this discussion. In preparation, I did some research in what official US policy is, the speeches that have been given by US officials, recent trips to the Middle East by Secretary of State Blinken and so on, and how the US is acting and presenting itself. And my take on this is that US policy towards the Middle East is tortured or is paralyzed by what I call the two contradictions. The Chinese readers always number things. So I'm going to talk about the two contradictions. The first contradiction is that between the U.S. foreign policy elites' overwhelming focus on containing Chinese power in the Indo-Pacific region, while also containing Russia in Europe on one hand, and trying to remain a major military and political actor in the Middle East on the other hand. These, as I will explain, is a major contradiction in U.S. policy. The second contradiction is between between President Biden's desperate effort to cloak the geopolitical struggle against China and Russia as part of an idealistic drive similar to the Cold War era, as part of an idealistic crusade to defend democracy against authoritarianism on one hand. And the reality is that global geopolitical competition is entirely non-ideological in character and entails partnering with states that are not democratic in the drive to overpower China. So I think these two contradictions are really what befuddles U.S. diplomats, and they're always trying to contend with them to achieve U.S. aims, and they're always hobbled by the contradictions. So let me just say something about the first. I think it's crucial that scholars, analysts of American policy understand the obsession with China among American elites. And I'm going to be reading from a document that we should all be familiar with. It's the National Security Strategy adopted by the Biden administration and published in October 2022. And it says our global priorities. Number one, outcompeting China and constraining Russia. We will prioritize maintaining an enduring competitive edge over the PRC, the People's Republic of China, while constraining a still profoundly dangerous Russia. It goes on to say, the PRC is the only competitor with both the intent to reshape the international order and increasingly the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to do it. And what this says is, number one, of course, is that the US is the dominant world power. And number two, that it intends to remain so by any means necessary. And that means constraining China above all else. And this requires the complete mobilization of US power at every level, and that this takes priority over everything else. Now, what does that mean? It means a major military buildup in Asia, the deployment of additional US forces to the Indo-Pacific region, a vast increase in military spending on weapons, mainly naval and air power, to contest China and Asia. It involves alliance building, the creation of a network of anti-China states stretching from India throughout the Southeast Asia to Japan and South Korea. New alliances, the AUKUS arrangement, Australia, US, UK, the Quad, India, Australia, Japan, and the US, and many other diplomatic efforts. With regard to Russia, this effort involves multiple priorities: reasserting US leadership in Europe, rebuilding NATO as an instrument of US power, weakening Russia as a threat to Europe, weakening Russia as an ally to China and weakening Russia as a global competitor. And in the Western Hemisphere, in Africa, competing with Chinese and Russian gains. The point about all of this is that it requires, all of this is consuming, first of all, military resources, economic resources, technological resources. But I want to emphasize from my experience with dealing with the U.S. foreign policy apparatus, more than anything else, brain power, diplomatic capacity, the amount of time that Biden and Blinken can devote to the Middle East. It has shrunk significantly as a consequence of these other priorities. There simply isn't the capacity to devote to the Middle East as there once was. And to the degree that they're going to focus on the Middle East, it's going to be on to what degree the Middle East is a factor in this larger struggle. And Biden made this very clear in his visit to Saudi Arabia last year. He said, we will not walk away and leave a vacuum in the Middle East, he was saying, to be filled by China or Russia. This is the priority for the U.S. It's no longer oil as it once was. It's no longer terrorism as it once was. It is contending with China's gains in the area and Russia's gains in the area. But there's a contradiction. The U.S. possesses fewer levers of influence, and there's the second contradiction of its professed commitment to democracy and human rights as part of this mobilizing the world to contain Russia and China. It stabs itself in the back, as it were, by trying to talk the talk in the Middle East, and this alienates its potential allies who don't want to have anything to do with it. So, U.S. capacity in the Middle East is diminished, and its primary goal is to contain China as much as possible by developing military ties, to strengthen the military ties that Muin spoke of. The primary instrument here at this point is the Middle East Air Defense Alliance, mainly behind the scenes, but U.S. military officials working with those of Israel, the UAE, Bahrain, and other countries to integrate, slowly but surely integrate the air forces and air defense instruments of the Middle East countries into a U.S.-led anti-Iranian force behind the scenes. But this is a feeble effort compared to what we've seen in the past.
For sure. For sure. And we can, thank you, Michael, just to, that's a really important point, because we've seen lots of other alternatives kind of happening behind the scenes. We also know that there's increasing use, or perhaps continued use, of economic sanctions levied against multiple countries in the region, including Syria and Iran, as well as the presence of U.S. troops, such as a minimal presence in Syria and elsewhere. Maybe we'll get back to some of those alternatives in a second, but first I want to invite Sarah Hagdusti to maybe tell us a little bit about how the region looks from your perspective. Sarah is the executive director at Win Without War, which is a network of activists and scholars looking at kind of pushing the U.S. towards a more progressive and peaceful foreign policy. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us. Can you tell us how things look from your perspective in light of all these changes?
Thank you so much for having me and for hosting this really important discussion. I think for me, what is really interesting when we talk about these changes is how much a Cold War mentality has overtaken a lot of analysis and how that is shaping a lot of thinking and policy solutions that are being put forward. And for me, what was really interesting was just how surprised people in DC and pundits in DC were at China's growing engagement in the Middle East. And for me, a great example of this was when there was the announcement that China brokered a deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran. The level of surprise was incredibly telling. And again, an illustration of how this Cold War mentality we're in is shaping what I would suggest is some pretty bad analysis, because I don't think China's growing role should, and their role as a perceived honest broker, should come as a surprise to anyone, especially when you look at the history involved here, especially in the Middle East. Russia and the US have such problematic, violent, and colonial histories across the region. If you look at Iran, if you look at, in particular, Afghanistan, China has much less of that baggage. And because of that, it becomes easier for it to broker a lot of agreements. But that all said, that's not what you hear when you listen to Senate committee hearings. So in Senate hearing after Senate hearing, or amongst various analysts and commentators, we hear what is, I would pose, again, really problematic rhetoric and increasingly escalatory rhetoric towards China that focuses on its supposed want to just militarily expand in every direction. And it's almost to the point where it's created this caricature that is now being taken as supposed fact that all analysis should stem from. And to me, that's a real problem. Again, it is leading to bad policy solutions and really limiting the debate. So what we saw, and again, the Saudi-Iran deal was a great example of this, the level of alarm some of them had over this deal harkens to that Cold War mentality. And we're almost in this world where we've gone back to domino theory, where we assume that every diplomatic engagement is some sort of competition for the loyalty of the countries in question. And I think that's just incredibly short-sighted and incredibly flawed. Countries are going to engage with the two biggest economies in the world, no matter what US diplomats do. That's just the nature of the world we live in at this point. And especially when you look at a country like Saudi Arabia, I would argue it's not really clear what the benefit has been to us having Saudi Arabia for the past few decades, given their both egregious human rights abuses and their willingness to support Putin, especially when you looked at the way they were manipulating OPEC markets to manipulate the cost of oil. Now, all that said, I think there are some real reasons to be concerned about the way China is growing its influence in the Middle East. And what I'm concerned about is when you take a step back and look at the rise of authoritarianism around the world, having more authoritarians engage with each other like this often doesn't lead to good human rights outcomes. And what I am really worried about is the more China engages with authoritarians who have consistently shown that they are more concerned about safeguarding their own regimes than what is good for their people, they're going to use it as a talking point to distract from their own outrageous and brutal relationship with Muslims in China, and particularly the treatment of Uyghurs, and use that as a way to say, we don't have an Islamophobia problem, look at how much we do in the Middle East. And I think that's a real risk that we need to make sure doesn't happen. And we need to make sure that no one falls into the trap where Ayatollahs in Iran or MBS are the ones that get to define who is and isn't Islamophobic and who is and isn't treating Muslims well in their countries. So I really wanted to pull that out. But putting all of that aside for a second, I think for me, there's a really important lesson in all of this in terms of the opportunity cost that Cold War thinking presents, especially right now. Like many of us are seeing the highest temperatures ever recorded. We're seeing the global rise of climate change that is the biggest existential threat we face as humanity. And China could have a really productive role there. You could see China helping a lot of countries go from increasingly fossil fuel-based and oil-based economies to ones that rely more on renewable energy. And I think the biggest question for me is, how do we get to the point where our diplomacy is more focused on how can we make people's lives genuinely better? How can we create more space for democracy and human rights activists? And how can we really solve the threat of climate change? Because no single country can do that by themselves. We need global cooperation in there. But how do we do that and get those conversations to happen in a way that empower civil society, in the way that empower localized actors, and don't empower authoritarians and really put us into this global arms race that is just leading to bad outcomes and lose-lose-lose situations across the region and here in the US?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sarah. That's really useful to sort of think about the societal imperatives and kind of what are their interests here, and where can we think of forums to sort of think about sort of articulating those. And I think it's important to return to that. But we've mentioned China many times for good reason, and it's great to have on this panel one of the leading experts on Chinese foreign policy, Carla Freeman, who is a senior expert for the China program at the U.S. Institute for Peace. Carla, thank you so much for joining us. You've written and you work on kind of the Chinese foreign policy vision for perhaps at the global level in terms of political, economic security, and also in particular for the global South. Can you give us a sense of that? I mean, your work doesn't necessarily focus on the Middle East in particular, but maybe give us a sense of the big picture of where China thinks it's kind of the world should be and where its role in it might be.
Thank you so much for having me. And I am still very much a student of China and international affairs. It's a pleasure to join you in this very distinguished panel. So I will try to contribute to today's discussion by talking generally about China and the global South. You have to be cautious about making generalizations about Chinese foreign policy toward the global South, because of course the global South is vast and diverse. I had a colleague, Ashton Malavi, when I was at Hopkins, who talked about the emerging 85%, and I think it's really actually more than 85% of the world. And Chinese foreign policy toward this most of the world is also very diverse. There's a geographic set of differences. China pays close attention to countries in its periphery, along its borders in different ways than it might interact with big emerging regional economies like those represented in the BRICS. But having said all of that, let me contradict myself by trying to say something general about China's foreign policy toward the global South, and then comment really briefly on recent developments, including the Global Security Initiative that you alluded to. In the interest of efficiency, I'll break this into goals, the goals that China has for its foreign policy in the global South, and then address some of the forms that its foreign policy generally takes, and then maybe make a comment or two about China and the Middle East, although that's not a part of the world I do generally work on. In terms of goals, again, as Professor Claire mentioned, China likes to think about things in terms of numerically. So there, I think China has four main goals: promoting China's influence, shaping the international order, and increasing focus of its interest in the global South, enlarging its economic opportunities there, including sourcing natural resources, and also shrinking Taiwan's international space. Since China's earliest years, China's seeing the developing world as a target of opportunity, so there's a lot of continuity there. It was an important source of political legitimacy, which it continues to be, apart from the communist bloc back in those days. But it was also a source of support as China pushed against US-led Western containment in its earliest years. So the strategies and tactics have evolved over the decades, but those are goals that are really fairly consistent. And China has seen big payoffs from its close ties to the global South, political and economic. For example, the G77 were critical to Beijing's ability to enter the United Nations in 1971, and then the economies in the global South are very important in the wake of Tiananmen and post-Tiananmen sanctions, and China was able to pivot to the global South for markets and friends. China also sees its ties with the global South as critical to its global diplomatic influence, and today increasingly to its efforts to transform, if you will, world order, so that order more closely aligns with Chinese interests, preferences, and priorities. And China sees getting the global South on board with this effort as important to its potential success. And China's actually pretty confident that the world that it envisages is one that the global South can support, a world that's not dominated by the United States and the West, and that puts the United Nations at the center of the international system, and is committed to principles that China's pushed since the Bandung Conference of non-interference, and increasingly in more recent years in the debate over human rights, emphasizes development over other types of human rights, and gives a greater voice to developing countries within global institutions. And of course, the global South is also key to China's economic rise, and you see this in China's relations with the Middle East. Very important economic ties and critical to China's energy security, a major driver of Chinese foreign policy. And then, as I mentioned, China has cultivated relations in the global South in part to ensure support for the One China principle that it pushes, and to eliminate international recognition of Taiwan. Now there are just 13 countries in the world that accord normal diplomatic recognition to Taipei. Beyond that, in terms of form, economic diplomacy and economic ties are very, very important. China's developed an array of business and financial relationships with countries throughout the global South. And remember, these infrastructure projects that China has emphasized under the rubric of the BRI, but was doing that even before with the Tanzam Railway. These are long-term projects. And so they have additional benefits beyond just the economic outcomes that they may generate. And China's also emphasized sort of traditional ways of building ties with the global South through people-to-people ties. And when I was a student in Beijing in the 80s, there were many engineering students from Africa there, and there's been a real explosion of students thanks to Chinese scholarship studying in China from all over the global South, particularly as Chinese universities gain global stature. And then also Chinese cultural experiences are very important. I know Saudi Arabia now integrates Chinese language into its curriculum at all levels. Media cooperation, very important and welcome by particularly repressive governments. China's very good at controlling its media. And military cooperation to promote China's influence and to encourage military sales, and interoperability through military and other security ties. My colleague Samir Lalwani has a useful concept for this. It calls it a threshold alliance. And China's building those kind of threshold alliances with key security partners around the world. And I could go on, but one of the forms that China has used, particularly effective forums, is these special multilateral groupings, these cooperation forums. the China Arab States, League of Arab States grouping, and its Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which of course Iran is now a member of since just a week or two ago. And as you mentioned, Omar, these new initiatives that China has launched, not only the BRI, which is fundamentally about infrastructure and connectivity, but these latest new initiatives since 2021, the Global Development Initiative, where China emphasizes its interest in supporting the SDGs, but also the role of the state in economic development, and focuses on knowledge transfer through Chinese channels, capacity building along those lines. The GCI, this really interesting global civilization initiative, which I think, if you examine the language, it's really a push for not just so much diversity, but relativism, and and has implications for universal values and human rights. And then the Global Security Initiative, something launched by Xi Jinping himself in 2022, which promotes Chinese concepts of security, which are very different from the kinds of, which have implications for the kind of global security architecture that might evolve out of these principles, because they eschew alliances and those types of arrangements in security, supporting something called common security, even using the concept of indivisible security, which Putin, of course, alluded to as a justification for his invasion of Ukraine. And another dimension is of course, under the rubric of the GSI, China has promoted peacemaking efforts and elevated the role of its role in brokering deals. A lot of focus is on the Saudi Iran rapprochement as a really unprecedented success by China. But it's certainly not the first time China's played a role, tried to play a role in brokering peace. From the six-party talks, it's had special envoys in the Middle East, including for Syria, for a while, and has talked for a long time about playing a role. Now it's giving a lot more energy to that in the Israel-Palestine situation. So I think I will leave it there. I have a few more points, but I will say that there are a lot of challenges for China in selling its vision for global security, and even its economic ties are not universally welcomed throughout the global South. Some of the arrangements that countries in the global South made to build infrastructure have proven highly complicated and indebting. In addition, countries in China's immediate region are wary of China's push for a greater global role in global security, because China has territorial disputes and a very, very powerful military. So it's not as if China if this is a contest between the US and China, that China is winning. I think we have to remember that all of these countries have a great deal of agency and they welcome the opportunity to choose. What they don't want to have happen is to get themselves dragged into a sort of Cold War where they are forced to choose. So I'll just leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Carla. That's really great, and lots of different dimensions to China's presence. Thank you for noting that obviously it's not necessarily homogeneous and linear. There are contradictions there, as well as with US foreign policy, given the fact that China is so vast and its footprint is global. I wanted to invite you all to see if you have any kind of follow-ups on what you said, but I have something in mind, just inspired by both what Carla and Sarah also raised about, first of all, this Cold War mentality. And if we think about the Cold War, we think about kind of the Soviet Union and the United States as the two major poles. But that also at that time provided a space, their existence provided a space for like policy space and policy autonomy in the global South. At that time, the United Nations was or became for a brief period of time in the 60s and 70s a space where developing countries can articulate economic and social kind of demands. I mean, the Middle East has its own problems, aside from, right, being a platform for the struggle of the US and China. And so I guess my question is about questions of environmental injustice, given the boiling heat that we have all over the world. There are questions of economic inequality. There are questions of ongoing conflicts in the region itself. Just yesterday, we had a reminder of that with the House resolution stating proudly that Israel is a firm ally of the US and denouncing its critics. So where is I guess my question is, where is the venue or the platform for these kind of conflicts and these issues to emerge? Is this left to civil society? Is multilateralism no longer an option? Is the United Nations no longer the place where these issues can be advocated for? I guess it's maybe a speculative question, but for us in the project, we want to be aware of the geopolitics in order to kind of think about the societal impact, the societal, human development, human well-being. And, from your perspective, where do you see those of us and the lots of people in the region beyond who care about environmental destruction, who care about, the conflicts and the injustices in the region? Where do we turn to next? Where do you think the future of that will be? Or is it something that's going to be too much of a patchwork to kind of be able to sort of think about? I'm really curious to see where you see some openings or where the pressure points should be moving forward. I don't know, Moeen, do you have any, or do you want to follow up on any of the comments that were raised before?
No, it was very interesting to listen to all the different contributions. I would just say, this is only a partial response to your question. In contrast, I mean, during the Cold War, regional states were very invested in that rivalry and were invested in its outcome. So Saudi Arabia, for example, didn't reestablish diplomatic relations with Russia until after the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Countries on the whole were either clearly aligned with the US or with the Soviet bloc. Situation now is entirely different. I think it's fair to say that most regional states do not feel invested in the global rivalry between the US, Russia, and China. American plutocrats, Russian oligarchs, Chinese state capitalists. I think here again, Saudi Arabia is a perfect example. They cooperate with all three on the basis of what best serves their interests. They don't, the outcome of these global rivalries have much less significance for regional states than did the outcome of the Cold War, because they don't see that there is an intrinsic threat to their own stability and survival from any of these global actors, and therefore they seek to cooperate and derive benefit from all of them. Now, regarding your question about where is there a forum for promoting these issues, I find that a much more difficult question to answer, because yes, the United Nations still exists, but has also in fundamental respects become less significant and less relevant on these kinds of issues. You look at the League of Arab States, I mean, it barely deserves the name that it has, and it's become more an instrument of division rather than coordination. The same, could be said for other regional bodies, and I think it's non-aligned movement has become a shadow of its former self. And so I guess that's a long way of saying I don't really have a clear answer of where you might have a regional or global forum where these kinds of issues could be discussed and debated.
Michael, maybe I'll turn to you because you've done a lot of work on climate change and perhaps also have some thoughts about, can climate be an issue to push back against this US-Chinese polarization?
Yeah. Can I just say first, I think we should be very careful about using the term Cold War, although, I acknowledge it's useful, Sarah, that to put it that way, because there's a lot of Cold War-like behaviors. But I remember the Cold War all too well. And it did have a powerful ideological thrust to it. It went deep into society, that we were engaged in an ideological struggle against demonic authoritarian communist forces. And, in a way that allowed civil society to use that. The civil rights movement in the United States really took hold of that and said, you can't promote, anti-communism and freedom internationally and deny it at home. And that really was a turning point for the civil rights movement. There's nothing equivalent to that now. It's a sham. The Biden approach to, calling this a struggle for democracy, it can't be taken seriously. It's a fraud. And everybody realizes that. The United States is moving slowly but surely in an anti-democratic direction. Let's pray that it doesn't go all the way to fascism, but we're moving in that direction. And Biden, bless his heart, is trying to avert that. But this is not a country where the push for democracy abroad is being reflected at home, or the case in allied countries. So I think it's that contradiction that we have to seize upon. That's not an answer to what you said, Omar, but I think there is a disjunction between elite thinking in Australia, Japan, South Korea, the European countries, and many other parts of the world. The elites are committed to this contain China drive, but civil society is not. And civil society is what is suffering from climate change and these other effects. So the change is going to have to come within civil society. And I think there is a recognition in, I know less about the Middle East, but certainly in places like the Philippines and South Korea and Japan, Australia, New Zealand, which is where the push against China is strongest, that civil society is not embracing this crusade, but thinking about how it is going to suffer from climate change and the rest. So that's where I think this struggle has to take place.
Thanks, Michael. Sarah, do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, what are let's say, how would you identify Win Without Wars priorities or thinking about this in the terms of what are the pressure points, or what do you feel you can advocate for, especially that you're involved also with kind of supporting change makers within the Middle East in particular?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, before we can talk about forums where we can discuss this, there's a really important step we need to take around accountability. Like, what I'm really concerned with and what I've seen over and over again is in the US, the rise of anti-Asian hate. And we're seeing across academia, even in Congress, Asian Americans consistently having their loyalty questions, being victims of really substantial racist attacks. And for me, as an Iranian woman who grew up during the height of the War of Terror, so much of that reminds me of what happened to my community in those years as well. And I think there's an innovation and analysis that's happening across movements and across people who are making those connections in a way that elites aren't. And so often when we talk about these issues, we leave out those personal memories, those personal experiences and people. And I think that that is what we need so desperately in all of these conversations. Whenever we move towards thinking about these issues, like it's a 4-level game of chess, and like it is gamified in really disturbing ways. There was war games happening in Congress where people pretended that the US had all of the power and no other countries had agency. And again, it was a game. Whereas when you really center that there are people involved here, and when you look at the increasing rhetoric, people are harmed as a result of it, just like people are being harmed by extreme weather temperatures. And how do we solve that? How do we shift our national security discussions to be less about what is in the interests of elites, what is going to get weapons contractors their biggest profits, to what is genuinely good for people and what brings our community safety? That is where that discussion is going to happen, and it is rooted in accountability and action.
Yes, that's a great concept, accountability, and I think it's something that we all need to think about in light of this past 20 years and this desire to kind of move us, forget about the global war on terror, move towards the new paradigm and forget about everything that's happened. And that's something that lingers and needs to be addressed despite these shifts. Carla, can you give us some thoughts from your perspective on all of this?
Well, many jumbled thoughts, and as you know, I have to hop off in a moment. But just to address the issue of climate change, because John Kerry was just in Beijing talking to the Chinese about ways for the U.S. and China to work on climate change, and this is always seen as a potential bright spot in the relationship. He didn't come back with much, but at least he started the dialogue up again. And I think this is where it would be really wonderful if there were some virtuous competition in this area, where the rest of the world really demanded that the U.S. and China, if they want to wear the mantle of global leadership, that they have to take more responsible action to do more in the area of climate change mitigation and pro-climate policies. China has done a great deal and has emerged as a major, the leading player in green energy and clean energy. But that's an industrial policy really for China. It's still building a lot of coal plants. But I think it's something that the United States it needs to invest more in itself. And you hope that watching China's successes in this arena, that the United States would pour more money into its own green industries. But we also have to transfer technology. We also have to use our capabilities to engage in adaptation. And here's where even in helping respond to climate change disasters, the U.S. and China could do much more together. But right now in Washington, these kinds of activities are just really almost impossible to talk about. And it will be interesting if John Kerry is able to say, hey, we should be at least sending our respective navies to work together to respond to humanitarian disasters around the world, since we have these capabilities and they're much needed.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Carla. And thank you to all our panelists. This has been a really great discussion. There's so much to, of course, discuss further. Our plan is to have this be the first in a series of webinars. This one was meant to set the stage and give us kind of the broad contours of what's taking place in the region. But I'd like to thank you all for coming. I'd like to thank my colleague, Maria Abu Zaid from Notre Dame University in Lebanon, who is a senior researcher with us, who organized this. We'll be, with Maria, organizing a set of other panels around each of these kind of sub-themes, and we hope to have you back, if possible, to comment on them further. So thank you so much, and Have a good rest of your day.